Good day. Today is Wednesday, 7th January 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if once you've watched this video or whichever part of the video you want to watch, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate this fact. Well, today, even as much of the world is still debating the conflict or the events in Venezuela, the big news is that we are on the brink of what appears to be a developing superpower confrontation, a direct superpower confrontation of a kind that we have not had since the Cold War. I say this because the United States continues to chase and pursue an oil tanker formerly known as the Pella 1. I thought it was called the Pella 2, but it turns out it was called the Pella 1. Apparently this tanker is empty, it carries no oil. Apparently it was trading in some way in Venezuelan oil. It was sanctioned by the United States. It transferred to the Russian Merchant Navy register. The crew painted a Russian flag on the hull, which caused some confusion on the part of the American authorities and meant that it wasn't seized when it might have been. There are reports that this transfer to the Russian Navy register was the result of a fire sale by the ship owner, whoever that was, and the Russians, so that the ship was actually bought by the Russians, which makes it now Russian property. And this ship, whose name has changed, has been steaming apparently towards the Russian port of Murmansk, which lies in the Arctic. Well, the United States has been monitoring the movements of the ship. The US Coast Guard continues to conduct surveillance of it. I haven't yet heard that the US Navy is directly involved, but I expect probably that before long it will be. And interestingly, the Russians have now put on a show of force. At least this is what the reports say, because there are reports circulating, and they're circulating in the American media and in the British media this morning. So this is not something that comes just from independent media. The mainstream media are reporting it as well. Anyway, the reports say that a Russian submarine has now taken station, essentially guarding or protecting this tanker from seizure by the United States. Now, of course, the thing about submarines, by definition, is that they are invisible. So we cannot confirm, I cannot confirm visually that these claims are actually true. Just saying. However, to repeat again, they are circulating right across the Western media this morning. And I would add that if we're talking about a submarine operating in the North Atlantic, a Russian submarine operating in the North Atlantic and acting as a guard for a tanker, then I would assume in this location we would be talking about a nuclear-powered submarine, which might carry nuclear weapons. The Russians do have nuclear weapons in some of their submarines. I'm not saying that this one does. And a nuclear submarine providing protection to a single oil tanker, which was not even part of the Russian merchant fleet 2 weeks ago. So what is going on? Why are the Americans so intent to seize this ship, this particular ship? And why are the Russians so intent to protect it? It begs lots of questions to which I do not have, obviously, the definitive answer. But I am going to suggest that probably the logic behind all of these actions from the Russian side is not so much to protect this particular tanker. Rather, it is to convey a message of intent to the United States that the Russians will protect ships that carry their flag, even ships that have acquired their flag in this very dubious way. And though, because of the hasty way in which this operation by the Russians has had to be done, the naval asset that has had to be deployed to provide some protection to this ship has had to be a nuclear submarine. Probably what the Russians are telling the Americans is that they're prepared to go to any lengths to protect their own maritime shipping. And yes, they are prepared to deploy nuclear submarines, but in future what is more likely to happen is that we will have convoys, and that these convoys will be protected mostly by the Russian surface navy, which, by the way, is substantial in size, bigger in size than I think many people appreciate or fully understand. So I think this is what is happening, and I strongly suspect also that one of the causes, one of the reasons why this has triggered this Russian action, why the Russians have decided to make a particular point in this affair, is because of those reports which appeared over the course of the New Year holiday, where in the US media, in which the US intelligence community, the CIA, openly bragged about their role in assisting Ukraine to carry out drone attacks, not just against the territory of Russia itself, against the oil refineries and such things, but also against ships, merchant ships, which have been involved in trade with Russia, the so-called shadow fleet ships, which have been trading with Russia. And all of this has been combined with a concerted practice over the last few weeks, whereby more and more of these ships, and apparently the Pella 1 has been involved in trade with Russia in the past, more of these ships, undoubtedly by arrangement with the Russians, are now starting to transfer to the Russian flag and are joining the Russian Merchant Navy register. So a lot is going on, and as I said, the Russians are drawing a red line, or at least drawing a line for the United States. I have to say this, and I want to say this in advance, in case anything does happen over the next couple of days, that I am not myself sure that if the United States does try to seize the Pella 1 as it transits into the Barents Sea past the coast of Scotland, I'm not sure that this Russian nuclear submarine will take immediate action or is under instructions to take immediate action. A submarine, a nuclear submarine, hardly seems to me to be the kind of system, the kind of ship that really is best suited to this kind of convoy duty. Russia does have a significant fleet of what the Russians refer to as Navy corvettes, but which Western navies would refer to as light frigates, equipped with air-to-air missiles and guns, and also, by the way, surface missiles. And they seem to be much more suited to this kind of convoy duty, certainly fully capable of taking action against the US Coast Guard. They seem to be much more capable of that kind of thing than a nuclear submarine would be. A nuclear submarine is intended to be used in a war, and I think that for the moment at least, neither the United States nor the Russians are eager to start a direct war with each other. But the point is that, and I repeat this again, I think this whole set of steps that we have seen with the Pella 1 have been taken by the Russians in urgent haste. Probably there were no Russian surface ships in the region, in the area, and for that reason they've had to deploy a nuclear submarine in place of a surface ship of the kind, as I said, that is available. Though I would say these sort of ships have limited range, but extensive enough range, I think, to provide cover for merchant ships in the Arctic and the North Sea and the North Atlantic until they reach safer waters, just saying. Anyway, I think that this is why a nuclear submarine has been deployed so rapidly and so hastily in this fashion. Probably a nuclear submarine which was on station, deployed in the North Atlantic as part of Russia's constant military posture. So this is a confrontation. If the United States now does take moves to seize the ship, then it will be seen in Moscow as a clear statement of intent by the United States, and I suspect that the next Russian reaction will be stronger, and the Russians anyway are signalling that they're prepared to take action to defend their merchant ships. One thing which I am sure the Russians would do in this situation is consult with their friends in China. China now has the biggest fleet in the world. Again, not all the Chinese ships are geared to naval involvement around the world. In terms of tonnage, the US Navy still has the lead, and of course it still has many more aircraft carriers than China does, and Russia at the moment has no operational aircraft carriers at all. But again, would the United States be prepared to take on Chinese warships providing escort duty to ships that conduct maritime trade? Would they want to do that against the Russians? Confrontations of this kind, as I said, have a habit of getting out of control, and I would have thought that the United States, which has been trying in some way to improve relations with Russia, and which is clearly nervous of a confrontation, provoking a confrontation with China, well, I suspect that they will act carefully. Anyway, this is an interesting and important episode. It shows what the Russians really think about the United States and about the Trump administration in particular. And we will have to keep an eye on this and see how it shapes out. Anyway, this is a developing story, as it is said. The Russians themselves have not confirmed that there is a nuclear submarine in the area. I'm assuming that there is, because as I said, there's been all these multiple reports about it in the media, and I presume that these do come from the United States itself. We'll have to see what happens. Anyway, that then brings me forward to the next issue, because today in Russia, it is Christmas Day. And perhaps after these rather ominous words about a superpower confrontation developing, a crisis between Russia and the United States on the high seas, may I now take this opportunity in this troubled and uncertain and very fraught time to wish all Russian Orthodox Christians a happy Christmas, a Merry Christmas, and a happy New Year. And, well, I hope that these ominous and frightening things don't mean that there will be further conflict and war between the West and their country. But recent events that have taken place in Paris, unfortunately, suggest otherwise. Because what happened in Paris over the last 24, 36 hours was another meeting of this grotesquely ill-starred so-called coalition of the willing that Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, have cobbled together. Now, this meeting in Paris, which the Americans also attended, and which was supposed to be attended by the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, though in the event he failed to turn up, he's apparently tied up with more important things, Venezuela and such, and he didn't go. So the United States instead was represented by Steve Witkoff, who, remember, doesn't actually fulfill any very clear role within the US government. And apparently Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was also there. Anyway, this coalition of the willing meeting took place in Paris. And of course, Zelensky himself was also there. The European leaders all greeted him enthusiastically and fervidly. Merz was there, Macron was there, Meloni was there, Starmer was there, others also were there. And as always at these meetings, when Zelensky is attending, he appears to be the hero of the hour. I will say that the film footage that I saw did seem to me to suggest that one person who was less enthusiastic about meeting Zelensky was Steve Witkoff. He seemed to be rather offhand in meeting Zelensky, but that was certainly not true of the European leaders. Now, what we were told in advance was that this was going to be a meeting to discuss security guarantees that would be provided in the event of peace by the Western powers to Ukraine. And there's been much discussion as to what these security guarantees might amount to, with Zelensky himself talking about Article 5 type guarantees. This references Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, the treaty that established NATO, just to say. So, security guarantees akin to NATO membership, just saying. And, well, there was a lot of speculation, lots of expectations that yesterday the United States would actually announce its intention to provide precisely these. Anyway, the meeting took place. It lasted for 5 hours. They came out of the meeting, and there was indeed a statement, but the United States never signed it. Witkoff, I presume he would have been the signatory, didn't sign whatever document it was, whatever draft it was that they were all working with. And Witkoff did talk a lot about security guarantees. He said that there would be security guarantees for Ukraine. He said that the security guarantees would be very strong as any. He said that this remained the intention of the president, of Donald Trump, but he provided no real substantive details. It was all, again, very vague indeed. I have to say this, that I get the sense, and this is where I come back to what I said, about the fact that the Americans, for all their posturing, for all of their many aggressive acts, for all the missile strikes that they carried out during the period of the Biden administration inside Russia with ATACMS missiles, for all the game the CIA has been playing in launching in assisting the Ukrainians to launch drone strikes in Russia, for all the threats about Russian ships and all of that, the United States ultimately does not want to find itself in an all-out military confrontation with the Russians, especially over a country like Ukraine, which of course it has never at any point in time since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 actually committed itself to defend. I suspect that with the steady shift in the global military balance, the United States, or at least the US military, is probably even less willing to come to the defense of Ukraine and to involve itself in a military confrontation with the Russians now than it has been in the past. Since February 2022, the Russian military has increased hugely in size, and it has gained massive amounts of experience and knowledge about how to conduct a large-scale war. Knowledge, by the way, which the United States does not have. The Russians have leads in certain areas of technology, like hypersonic missiles and drones, just to say. And I think the United States, which has commitments all around the world, whose military downsized significantly in the previous 20 years, I think the United States, also very conscious of the growth of Chinese military power in East Asia, is absolutely not looking for a confrontation with the Russians, and that by definition makes it very nervous about providing security guarantees to Ukraine, security guarantees which are not first negotiated and agreed to by the Russians. And of course the Russians have repeatedly made it clear that they are not willing to countenance anything that resembles NATO-style security guarantees for Ukraine. So anyway, whatever the reasons, the Americans came up with vague words. They refused to be pinned down, and they agreed to sign nothing. And I suspect that was a major disappointment for the Europeans. I was reading in The Guardian that speculation, but I suspect it is not just speculation. I suspect there's an element of fact to it. That one of the reasons that Starmer was so nervous about saying anything even remotely critical about the operation that the United States has carried out in Venezuela, despite strong demand that he speak out against that operation from within his own party, the Labour Party. Anyway, this article in The Guardian suggested that one of the reasons Starmer was unwilling to make any criticisms at all was because he didn't want to upset the Americans in advance of this meeting in Paris, and he didn't want the Americans to give reasons to the Americans not to sign off on the kind of security guarantees, provide a statement of intent about security guarantees of the sort that the British and the French and the Europeans have been pushing for. If that is true, by the way, and of course this is speculation from The Guardian, if this is true, then I would once again point to a recent programme that I did, which has touched on the issue of Greenland. I said that if the European countries did not take a stand over Greenland, if they went along with whatever it is that President Trump plans to do with Greenland, if he does indeed annex Greenland, if they refuse to unite in opposition and condemnation of it and take steps basically to move beyond the alliance that Europe currently has with the United States. I said that would be appeasement. That would be much closer to the 1938 style appeasement than anything that has ever been suggested by anybody in terms of the diplomacy between the West and Russia. Just saying. Here, if the Guardian account is true, if Starmer did indeed avoid any word of even the faintest criticism of the United States over its actions in Venezuela in order to get the Americans to sign up in Paris to some statement of intent in relation to security guarantees, well, that would have been appeasement of Donald Trump and of the United States. And as we see, it failed, because it failed to deliver the result, which, by the way, tends to be the pattern with that kind of appeasement. Anyway, there we are. The Americans didn't sign, but the Europeans came out as aggressive, as belligerent as ever. So Keir Starmer makes statements. He says that Britain will stand by Ukraine, basically forever, as long as it takes. Yeah, certainly going beyond that, I expect. Anyway, Keir Starmer said all of that. He made all those comments. And of course, Keir Starmer and Zelensky and Emmanuel Macron signed together a joint statement committing to deploying European peacekeepers in Ukraine to monitor a ceasefire, as they put it. We have seen, by the way, the rationalizations for these deployments of European troops to Ukraine constantly shift. I remember when originally it was supposed to be a peacekeeping force. That was how it was described. It was going to be a peacekeeping force, which, by the way, by definition, implies that it would have been a force that, in order to maintain peace, would have actually fought the Russians if there had been a conflict, a further future conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So that was the first explanation, rationalization of it. The problem was very few European states were prepared to sign up for that. Nobody wanted to fight the Russians. Starmer and Macron made a massive effort in February of last year to try to get the Americans to provide what they called a backstop to this European peacekeeping force. Trump conspicuously refused to do so. I discussed this at length in programs that I did in February last year. Anyway, it didn't happen. And, well, we see that the Americans are still falling short in this regard too. Anyway, the peacekeeping force then turned into something else, some kind of a reassurance force, whatever that means, though there were some attempts to suggest that it would amount to an attempt by the Europeans to take positions in western Ukraine and in places like Odessa, thereby enabling the Ukrainians to deploy more of their forces located in the west of Ukraine to the central and east of Ukraine, in that way to fight the Russians. And we were told that it was not planned that these Western forces would indeed fight the Russians, though the Russians, for their part, repeatedly said that if the Europeans did send troops to Ukraine, the Russians would regard them as a threat and would attack them, would consider them, in effect, a military target. But anyway, that was the reassurance force. Now, ceasefire monitor is what they're supposed to be. It's completely unclear exactly what that means. It's, again, another explanation of what this force is for. Now, supposedly, it is to enforce a ceasefire. Except, of course, that the Russians have rejected a ceasefire. The Donald Trump, just 2 weeks ago, also said that he was not in favor of a ceasefire and that the Ukrainians would have to move forward to a full peace settlement with the Russians. And of course, that has not been negotiated. So anyway, the point is, the point nonetheless comes back to this. Macron, Starmer, and to some extent Friedrich Merz, he was also there. He also floated the possibility the German troops might also participate in this operation. An extraordinary idea, by the way, one deeply unpopular in Germany itself, especially amongst young people, and one which, of course, the Russians, with memories of the Second World War, are going to undoubtedly respond to strongly. Anyway, all of these calls, demands, proposals for European forces in Ukraine, well, they are no doubt in part intended to make the British and the French especially, and perhaps the Germans too, appear more important and more relevant in this process than they really are, giving the impression that they are playing some active role in it, when in fact they are mere bystanders in whatever dialogue the Russians and the Americans are conducting with each other. Well, that's one purpose, to achieve relevance and to inflate the reputations, the sagging, exhausted reputations of Keir Starmer and of Emmanuel Macron, and no doubt of Friedrich Merz too. But of course the other one, undoubtedly, is to prolong the war and to extend the war and to keep the war going. And my good friend Ian Proud, the former British diplomat, has now done a video on YouTube, which you can look up and find, in which he's pointed out that one of the effects of the sanctions, of which, by the way, he is undoubtedly an expert. He was the major person at the forefront in executing the British government's sanctions policy against Russia. That one effect, the true effect of the sanctions against Russia, has been to prolong the war in Ukraine, absolutely not to end it. And the same, surely, though I suspect much more intentionally, is the case with this deployment. It's an attempt to lock in the United States into Project Ukraine, again always by getting the Americans to give the Europeans some kind of a backstop, but it's also to introduce into the negotiations a issue, a topic, which, as far as the Russians are concerned, is a deal breaker. One which the Russians can be certain to reject, and one which they will reject, and one which, to say it straightforwardly, the Western powers, the British and the French, know perfectly well. As I said, that is the purpose, and that's why they're coming up with this idea repeatedly and all the time. This is the case despite the fact that there is no support in either country, in either France or Britain, for this project, at least from the wider population. In France, there is actual positive hostility. The French National Assembly currently strongly opposes this idea. The British Parliament would probably support it, and I suspect that feeling in Britain about this idea is, well, less engaged than it perhaps is in France. But I certainly don't get the sense in Britain that the British public has any great desire for some sort of adventure in Ukraine of the kind that Keir Starmer and his government wants to foist on the people here. So this, despite the fact, as I said, that this is unpopular with the wider populations, despite the fact that by universal admission, European militaries, the British, French and German militaries, are in no position to deploy convincingly strong forces to Ukraine. And for the record, and I know here of what I speak, the British military is now in a much worse condition than it was in February 2022 when the special military operation began. The German military likewise. I cannot speak here for the French military, about which I know much less, but I doubt that it is in much of a condition to take on the Russians either. And lastly, and not least, prolonging a war to what end? So that Ukraine can lose more convincingly and more completely than it is already doing. It does seem an extraordinarily strange thing to do, and prolonging a war so that who but Vladimir Zelensky can continue to remain president of Ukraine, continue to receive endless quantities of money from Europe. As I said, I've discussed in recent programs the 90 billion euro loan, and the fact that Zelensky is again coming up with more demands for more money to be supplied to Ukraine by the West. So prolonging, persisting with this policy, it makes no rational sense, but it's clear that the European leadership remains fervently committed to it. Now, that brings me to the situation in Europe and to the situation of the European leaders. The first thing I should say is that, in my opinion, 2025 was the worst year that the European Union has experienced since its creation. Everything has gone wrong. Firstly, we have had a mounting economic crisis, and I think crisis is an appropriate word to use to describe what is happening. We have a runaway process of deindustrialization underway in Germany. Unemployment there is rising. Debt levels are rising very, very fast. Thomas Kolber, the German economist, says that cracks are starting to appear in the German banking system. Not so much the big banks, but the small savings banks that are essential to the historic functioning of the German economy and to the support of the small business community there. There is a cascade of reports which, it must be said, ultimately originate from Gazprom, Russia's major gas export monopoly. And that has to make one cautious. But for the record, I believe these reports are true. Anyway, there's a cascade of reports that even as winter temperatures have now fallen significantly across Europe, levels natural gas reserves, especially in Germany, but across Europe are at historic lows for this time of year, and that the European Union, that the European economies are depleting these reserves faster than they should be doing at this particular time. Now, there's already been there were reports yesterday, I believe, of a blackout in Berlin. I don't suppose it was a very significant blackout. If it happened at all, I'm not absolutely certain that this report is true. By the way, I have friends in Berlin, and they weren't aware of a blackout, but Berlin is a big place, a fairly big place. So maybe it happened somewhere and they didn't notice it. But anyway, there's been reports at least of one blackout in Berlin. There's probably more problems of that nature coming. I don't believe that we are going to see the lights turned off across Europe this year, either in the winter or in the summer. But I remember how in 2021 there was a gas supply crunch. Gas prices rose because the Europeans, this is of course before the start of the special military operation, had started to buy increasingly gas on the natural gas spot market rather than agree to long-term contracts with Gazprom for supply of pipeline gas. And the argument, the justification was that going on the spot market meant that gas prices would be lower, but of course it meant that there weren't the same stable supplies that long-term contracts with Gazprom were providing, and it meant that there were also it meant that the resulting instability in supply, aggravated in 2021 by a long, dry summer, meant that natural gas prices in the autumn of 2021 began to surge. And, well, I wonder whether we might be looking at something like that again. Of course, the conditions today are much more tight than they were in 2021. At that time, Europe was still receiving pipeline gas through the Yamal and Nord Stream pipelines, and by the way, the Druzhba pipeline through Ukraine, and Turk Stream from the south. Nearly all of those pipelines, apart to some extent from Turk Stream, no longer function. So they're not getting pipeline gas from Russia as they once did. Today, it's either contracts with the Americans and the Qataris for LNG, which is more expensive, or it is even greater resort to the spot market than was true in 2021. So a supply crisis emerging in the summer, especially it's a hot, dry summer, I can imagine could cause further problems to European industry and to European consumers. Well, anyway, we will see. This is all a little looking ahead at the moment, and of course things might turn out otherwise. But there doesn't seem to be any forward planning by European officials about this. Certainly there is no public acknowledgement that there is a problem. And if these reports, which as I said ultimately originate from Gazprom, are true, then, well, we've seen that the set of decisions made in 2022 with the economic war, which began to really come home over the course of 2025 in the European Union, are creating much worse situation altogether. And 2025 was a bad year also because it was in 2025 that the military situation in Ukraine, which has been getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians and their Western backers since the defeat of Ukraine's counteroffensive of the summer of 2023. Anyway, it was in 2025 that the critical nature of the situation began to become more apparent, at least to objective observers, with a real possibility of a military collapse in Ukraine and a defeat in Donbass starting to hover over the horizon. But perhaps worst of all for Europe was the revelation in 2025 of the European leadership's complete irrelevance. We saw these dealings between the Americans and the Russians, which have been quite extensive. I mean, Putin has met Witkoff many times now, and he's spoken several times to Trump, and they've had a meeting. So one can't say that there isn't some kind of a dialogue going on between the Americans and the Russians, even if it isn't leading anywhere at the moment. But anyway, we've seen all of that happen. We've seen that the Europeans have been forced to take a second role, a secondary role in all of this. They can criticize and obstruct from the sidelines, but they have no actual ideas of their own to bring, and they're not capable of conducting diplomacy with the Russians by themselves. And what has also happened over the course of 2025 is that their own inability to sustain Ukraine by themselves has been exposed, the extent to which they are dependent on the Americans for all of this. And it's been exposed in the most obvious way. We've had a lot about European rearmament, but it's the Russians who are actually producing the large numbers of weapons at the moment. We've heard an awful lot about the need to increase the size of European armies, but it is the Russian army that has grown in size and become more powerful, much more powerful. And in the meantime, the Europeans are left looking weaker and weaker, even as their own relations with the Americans have increasingly frayed. Sometimes it has bordered on the poisonous. There was this meeting between Dan Driscoll and EU ambassadors in Kiev that took place a few weeks ago when the Americans were touting their 28-point plan. And there were reports that then appeared in the Financial Times complaining about how this meeting, in which Driscoll told the Europeans that the Ukrainians were going to lose the war, how the Europeans were upset and furious, and that they found the whole meeting nauseating. So this, as I said, 2025 was the year that exposed Europe's decline, a decline which continues to accelerate economically, diplomatically. Countries around the world, China, India, increasingly unwilling to engage with the Europeans, sometimes openly disrespectful to the Europeans, which is unsurprising given that European emissaries that come to speak to these countries, people like Annalena Baerbock and Kaja Kallas, frankly, are worthless. Just saying. Anyway, we've seen how Europe has faded. And we also see how the Europeans are trapped inside American foreign policies, some of which they support some of which they're probably less than enthusiastic about. They were pulled along in the tariff war against China, for example. Their once very strong economic ties with China have frayed. There's much talk about the devastating effect that the Chinese manufacturing exports are inflicting about European industry. But note that the Europeans have been completely unsuccessful by themselves in doing anything about this. German car industry continues to sag and fall. It remains wedded to conventionally powered cars and doesn't seem to be able to match the Chinese or indeed the Americans in production of electric cars. Europe, unlike Russia, has still not produced a single important social media platform. The Russians have VKontakte and, well, all sorts of others, Yandex and all sorts of others. There is no European equivalent, just saying. There is no European equivalent to the Russian Rubicon Group, which of course is all involved heavily in the drone war in Ukraine, but which, as I have pointed out, has many of the characteristics of a Russian tech company and appears to be organized and functioning very much on that basis. So, as I said, it is 2025 was the year when Europe's decline became increasingly visible. And the extraordinary thing is that in the midst of this crisis, this increasing social crisis, social, moral and economic crisis, the European leaders not only show no sign of changing course, they continue to double down. They continue to talk about sending troops to Ukraine. They continue prolonging a war which has proved economically disastrous for themselves. They are busy sanctioning people who criticize what they've done. The events with Jacques Beau that I discussed extensively in a recent program. They have meddled in elections in Romania, incredibly crudely. They cancelled an election in 2024. They then basically held the same election in 2025, but did so with every appearance that the outcome had been to a great extent prearranged. They did the same, of course, in Moldova. They've become more censorious, more critical, repressive in ways that has even brought American criticism down upon them. And they are adrift. People like the former EU foreign policy person, Josep Borrell, talk about how the Europeans must prepare themselves for the fact that their former alliance with the United States is ending. But they have come up with no plan, no idea of what to do when eventually it ends. I discussed in a recent program how the United States now does indeed seem to be focused very much on taking control of Greenland. I believe that the plan, the American plan, is actual outright annexation of Greenland. And I believe that this is only a matter of time. And I take seriously the claim that this might happen by the 4th of July of this year. But there is absolutely nothing that the Europeans are doing about it. There is no strong European delegation going to Washington to warn Donald Trump against this. There is no talk about deploying European forces to Greenland to defend Greenland and to assert Danish sovereignty over Greenland. Notice that Starmer and Macron talk about sending European troops to Ukraine, where they might be attacked by the Russians. Ukraine, remember, is neither a NATO country nor an EU country. But they won't even discuss or float the possibility of providing assistance to Denmark to enable Denmark, a country that is both a NATO country and an EU country, to defend its sovereignty in Greenland. The Danish MP, Ms. Frederiksen, who, by the way, is as appalling as all of the others, she has spoken about how if there is an attack on Greenland, an annexation by the United States of Greenland, it would be the end of NATO. But European leaders, other European leaders, Starmer, Macron and the rest, Merz as well, Meloni, they don't seem to be saying very much, and they're doing even less about this, even as these American threats grow louder and louder and the Americans start to take action. So Europe is in a terrible way, and yet they continue with the same policies. The only creative policy that they were able to come up with last year, creative in a certain sense that is, was to try to steal, misappropriate, misuse the Russian assets in Euroclear in order to go on funding Ukraine, as they said, for 2 years, even though in practice it would have been for less than 1. Anyway, that was the only ingenious plan that they were able to come up with. It was a disastrous idea, which thankfully they were not able in the end to move forward with, because the legal opposition was too strong. And just to return to a topic, the Russians are indeed prosecuting legal claims already about this, and their legal position is extremely strong now and has become even stronger as a result of that benighted policy that the Europeans engaged in last year, or at least attempted to engage in last year. Anyway, in the end, even that idea failed, and they cobbled together instead a 90 billion euro loan for Ukraine, which so far they have taken absolutely no steps that I'm aware of to crystallize, so that for the moment at least it doesn't seem as there's been any further money for Ukraine. Now, this is a crisis. This is a all-encompassing crisis across Europe. It is a crisis of diplomacy, of security, of economics, and it is a crisis in society. And above all, it is a crisis in politics. A system, a political system that is unable to come up with answers or change direction, even as that direction leads Europe off a cliff, can only respond by doing the same thing, escalating when it can, and by becoming internally more repressive. Well, that, of course, takes us back to these decisions made in Paris, prolonging a war that is in effect already lost. And one should say that political leaders across Europe continue to pay the price. In France, Emmanuel Macron's support, at least the people who say they approve of him, has fallen to 11%. He nonetheless insists that he's going to remain president of France right up until the conclusion and the end of his term. Just saying, he's going to cling on. He's going to be there all the time. In Britain, we've just had a very interesting opinion poll about the state of the Labour government. And, well, it's from YouGov, which, well, some people say is not perhaps the most reliable polling agency, but I think overall it probably is as good as any, at least in Britain. Anyway, it says that the Labour government's popularity has plunged to a new low despite attempts by Sir Keir Starmer to reset his premiership. A YouGov tracker monitoring the popularity of the current administration shows the government's net approval rating is now 59%, minus 59, its lowest since Keir Starmer took power. 70% of voters now disapprove of the government, according to polling carried out on January 5th, an increase on the previous peak of 69%. Rishi Sunak's government had a record net approval score of minus 63 in October 2022, weeks into taking office. Baroness May, Theresa May's low point was minus 61 in May 2019, whilst Liz Truss's government recorded a nadir of minus 68, also in October 2022. The amount of people who approve of Labour's performance in office has also fallen, reaching a record low of 11%. And we go on to read that we are now provided this poll has given us information about the standing of the parties, and Reform in Britain is ahead on 28.8%. The Conservatives are second on 19.6%, which, by the way, is a catastrophic low for the Conservatives. They've had what I suspect is a dead cat bounce over the last few months, largely because the Labour government itself has unravelled and because of some missteps, which, in my opinion, Nigel Farage has taken. But nobody, I think, expects that this dead cat bounce by the Conservatives will endure for very long. Anyway, Labour, the government with a massive majority, which won a landslide victory in the general election in 2024, though only with a plurality of around 34%, on a historically low turnout. Anyway, Labour is down to 17.6%, just saying. And perhaps most worrying for Labour is the seemingly unstoppable rise of the Green Party, which is now on 14.8%. In other words, less than 3 points behind Labour, and rising even as Labour continues to fall. I would not be surprised if at some point within the next few weeks and months, the Greens, who, to be clear on foreign policy, are no different from Labour, but who probably will find some support in the pro-EU, left of centre, middle class areas in some of the cities where the Labour Party previously had its strongest support. Anyway, I would not be surprised if the Greens overtake Labour in these places and push Labour into fourth place overall. So the Labour government is clearly failing and clearly losing support and continuing to do so at an accelerating rate. Macron is deeply unpopular in France. In Germany, even as Germany's recession goes on and on, with all the signs that it will deepen this year, Merz also is seeing his popularity fall, and I suspect it will continue to do so, also at an accelerating rate over the course of this year. And yet none of them, not one of these people, Macron, Starmer, Merz, Macron, Ursula, of course, and all of them, all of the rest, show any ability, any idea to come up with an alternative plan. I remember many years ago, way back in the mid 2000s, reading a book, After the Empire, by Emmanuel Todd, in which Emmanuel Todd suggested that as the United States begins to see its power fade, it would become more predatory and would begin to turn on its allies, which is, of course, arguably precisely what we are now seeing. And that, well, there might be a situation where the Europeans eventually have to turn to the Russians for some degree of support and protection. Well, Emmanuel Todd was right about the first part. He was utterly wrong about the second. Again, it was the judgment of a rational man, but we see that in today's Europe, policy is not made rationally. And, well, the Europeans, having decided that the Russians are their enemy, can do nothing else but appease Trump, even as Trump looks like he's prepared to take the Europeans, have the Europeans for lunch, gobbling up Greenland along the way. And all of the great talk about Europe reviving its economy, rebuilding itself, making itself assertive and independent and strong, all that it is doing so far is producing a great deal of hot air and an awful lot of debt on top of the debt that exists already. 2025 was a terrible year for the European Union. Everything suggests, this recent meeting in Paris suggests, that 2026 is going to be, if possible, even worse. The Europeans have no plan for Ukraine. Their idea of giving Ukraine the Russian assets, at least for the moment, has had to be put aside. They can't arm Ukraine from their own resources. They come up with these terrible ideas about seizing Russian assets and deploying European troops to Ukraine. These always run up against Russian opposition and Russian hostility, and the result is that they fade and the Europeans eventually have to retreat. So all they can do, since they refuse to talk to the Russians or conduct with negotiations with them, and everything else simultaneously goes wrong, is try and create as much trouble between the Americans and the Russians as possible, even as they appease the Americans, who, with respect to Europe, are becoming more and more unfriendly and more predatory and aggressive. I have said this before, but I want to say this again, that Europe, of all places, could have sunk so low that a continent that has produced so much history and so much culture, whose history is full of titanic and extraordinary figures who have shaped events and the world, that Europe should be reduced to this is something which is both astonishing and which should make any European extremely depressed and, in the end, very, very angry. Well, having said all of this, having discussed what happened in Paris, which is indeed remarkable, let me say a few more things about the situation in Ukraine, and then let me finish by talking briefly about the situation in Venezuela, the Venezuela situation, which of course continues. Firstly, in Ukraine, or at least in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, as I predicted, President Putin, after disappearing for several days, resurfaced. He attended a Christmas Eve service last night in a church in the Moscow region. He made some comments about Christmas. No doubt over the next couple of days we will see him back in harness and in action, and we will see the pace of Russian diplomatic and political activity begin to pick up intensively over the next few weeks. So that has happened. On the front lines, the reports speak of continued significant Russian advances in Zaporozhye region, of the Russians gradually closing the noose around the town of Orechov, preparatory, obviously, to a Russian advance on Zaporozhye region as well, and of the Russians also consolidating their positions around Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, no doubt in anticipation of further offensives later this winter, and of the Russians apparently conducting some kind of larger encirclement operation now against the Ukrainians in the Kupiansk area, where the impression is that the cauldron where the Ukrainian troops were trapped on the east bank of the Oskol River is indeed close to final collapse. However, having said all of this, it's been the Christmas holiday. That may not actually have had much effect on military activity, but it means that many of the reporting channels and journalists on the Russian, and by the way, the Ukrainian side, have been mostly silent, because this is a time when they, of course, enjoy the holiday with their families. And of course, beyond that, there is the winter, the fact that this has been a time of very heavy snowfalls, and of low winter temperatures. And anyway, everything at the moment seems to be, well, the conflict, the war, seems to be quieter than it was a few weeks ago. This is, by the way, completely unsurprising. After a big offensive, which has achieved significant things, you would expect a brief pause and a consolidation before further advances. I remember that exactly the same thing happened this time last year. Anyway, that is the situation so far in the war. Of the various appointments that Zelensky has made, which have now been the topic of a laudatory, inappropriately laudatory article in the Financial Times, other than the appointment of Kirilo Budanov as Zelensky's chief of staff, I don't think there's anything very much that need to be said. Perhaps the most interesting appointment is that of Shmyhal, the former defense minister, to the post of energy minister. I think he's been given what you might describe as a poisoned chalice. The reports from Ukraine said that energy minister was the job that nobody wanted, but apparently Shmyhal was given no choice. I don't think, as I've said already in several programs, that this changes anything. Over Venezuela, as I also discussed in my program, everything continues to remain completely uncertain and in total flux. Trump published another truly extraordinary Truth Social post in which he said that the Venezuelans would be giving 50 million barrels of oil to the United States in compensation for the losses that the United States has suffered. I'm not sure what those losses are, by the way. If the losses are that Venezuela moved forward with nationalization of its oil industry, I don't really see that that is a case that can be argued in court. At the time of the US nationalization, the Egyptian nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956, when British and French shareholders experienced losses. The United States argued that that was perfectly legal, and the shareholders hard luck. Anyway, that was then. Of course, we're talking now. I can understand maybe why the Americans feel differently about Venezuela, but I still don't see why anybody should think that Venezuela's oil is America's, or why the Americans have suffered loss because the Venezuelans nationalized their own oil industry. Anyway, that's another story. But anyway, he's published this extraordinary Truth Social post. He's also said in it that he is going to be the person who's going to be responsible both for the selling of the oil at market prices, and who will then decide what is done with the money, which is one of the most extraordinary statements from a president of the United States I've ever seen. We see the president of the United States declaring quite openly and brazenly that he's intending to set up a fund which he's going to manage. The words slush fund did pass through my mind. I wonder whether that is what this will become, assuming this deal ever crystallizes. Well, I say assuming, I have no doubt at all that that is exactly what it is going to become. For the record, the Venezuelans have not confirmed any of this, though they've not disputed it either. But Rodriguez, who is acting as interim president, has made some comments, actually harsher comments, about the United States over the last few hours. And apparently other personalities within the Venezuelan power structure, linked to Maduro and Hugo Chavez, have been even more forthright. And there is some sense that in Venezuela now there is a hunt for traitors underway. We will see where that goes. The other thing that happened yesterday, which left me completely unsurprised, though it has attracted a great deal of attention, is that the United States, in the proceedings against Nicolas Maduro, has dropped the story that he was the head of some gigantic drug cartel. There are reports that the United States is now effectively admitting that the cartel in question doesn't even exist, that it was a figment of the US imagination. Anyway, this has always been obvious to pretty much everybody. And, well, we can see that the justification for all the pressure on Maduro and on Venezuela that was provided over the last few months, well, now that it's served its purpose, it can be dropped, especially given that these arguments were so fantastic that they were obviously too much to present to a court, the court in New York, in what will, of course, anyway, continue to be a show trial. So nobody should be surprised by any of this. The Venezuela story continues. I take back none of the things I've said about it over the last couple of days. We will see where it all goes. But anyway, this is where I end my program today. The important thing that is happening is that President Putin is back in harness, and on top of and beyond that, we see that the Russians are now becoming more assertive against the Americans themselves, or at least this saga of the Pella 1, this oil tanker, strongly suggests that. I suspect that for some people in Moscow, the drone attack on Valdai, which of course the Americans and the Ukrainians have denied, though the Americans admit that there was a drone attack, though not on Valdai, but on some undisclosed an unidentified military facility nearby. Anyway, I suspect that for some people in Moscow, this may have been, well, shall we say, a deciding factor in hardening their positions even further. I said in a recent program that I believed that there was quite possibly an internal discussion underway over the Christmas holiday in which Putin himself was involved. It was unusual for Putin to disappear so completely over the course of the last couple of days, even allowing for the fact that, as I said, he probably does need some rest and holiday at this time. I wonder, as I said, whether the deployment of the nuclear submarine, assuming that it has happened, and the actions with the Pella 1, some of which we can definitely confirm, whether these are signals from Moscow that they do intend to take a much more assertive line with the United States and with the Trump administration in 2026. From their point of view, their diplomatic position has been strengthened. The events in Venezuela have, for the various reasons I've discussed many times, made them more important to China and put them, therefore, in a stronger diplomatic position. This may be the moment when they finally decide that the time has come to start to push back more strongly and more visibly against the United States. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X and Substack. Please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Please also remember to go to our shop. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.